Hello there, and welcome to this lecture. My name is Mudassir. So this lecture is actually one of the few lectures that I'll be uploading on one of the oldest AWS services, S3. So let's quickly get started. So what is S3? Well, S3 basically stands for Simple Storage Service. So it's three S's. That's why it's called S3. Okay, and it provides users with secure, durable, highly scalable object level storage. Amazon S3 is easy to use, and with a simple web services interface, we can store and retrieve any amount of data from anywhere on the web, anywhere in the world. Okay, so S3 is a safe and it's a secure place where you can store all your files. And when we say files, when we say object-based storage, we are actually talking about flat files, basically. Okay, so Word documents, pictures, movies, and stuff like that. Okay, so data is spread across different facilities to ensure that your data is kept available all the time. So it's spanned across multiple facilities that AWS has, and it ensures that your data is absolutely safe, secure, and also it's available to you all the time. And as far as understanding the basics of S3 goes, okay, so S3 is an object-based storage. That means you can upload files to it, and then your files can be anywhere from 0 bytes all the way up to 5 terabytes. So this is the size limit for each object. Okay, so each object can range from 0 bytes and it can go all the way up to 5 terabytes. Okay, so there is unlimited storage. Okay, so basically this 0 bytes to 5 terabytes is an object based limit, but there is no cap on the overall storage. So you can store as much as you want. It basically scales up as you keep on uploading stuff to your bucket. The bucket keeps on scaling upwards. All right, so there is no cap on the storage in S3. Files are stored in these things called as buckets. Okay, so the word bucket might seem a little strange. To be honest, it did to me as well when I heard the term for the first time. But you can simply think of it as a folder in which you're storing all your files. That's all it is. It's a folder in which you're uploading your stuff, in which you're uploading your files. All right. And one important thing that you must remember about S3 is that S3 is a universal namespace. That means the names that are given to the S3 buckets, they must be unique globally. So when I create a bucket, I can't simply use a test or temp bucket name, because that name has already been taken long back by somebody, right? So when you create a bucket, the name has to be unique globally. And the reason for that is that it's actually creating a web address. Okay, so if we were to create a bucket in let's say Ireland region, okay, and let's say we name it Tech-Tok. Okay, so at the back end, it's going to create a web address that will look like this. Okay, so this part of it is the bucket name. Okay, then we have the EU West 1, which is the region name for basically this represents EU West 1 represents Ireland region in AWS. And then we have this Amazon AWS.com at the end of every bucket name. Okay, so let's say we were to create another bucket, the same bucket in let's say Singapore region. Okay, it would then create a name like this. So Tech-Tok again is the bucket name, and AP Southeast 1 basically represents your Singapore region, right? Similarly, let's say if we were to create, launch a bucket in the default AWS region, that is your North Virginia, the bucket would look like, the bucket name would look like this. So the bucket name .amazon AWS.com. So there is no region name here because this is the default region, and for the default region, the region name doesn't show up in your S3 bucket web address, right? The URL. So these are actually some examples of bucket names, and like I mentioned, S3 is a universal namespace, and all that you need to remember is that bucket names must be unique, and the reason for that is you're actually creating a web address. Another important thing to note in S3 is, mostly from an exam perspective, is that when you upload a file to S3, you will receive an HTTP 200 code if that upload was successful, and it's going to come back to your browser as a response. So let's say there is a scenario question asking you to upload a file to S3, and then it asks you like what kind of a code did you receive back. So it's a HTTP 200 code back to your browser, right? So as I mentioned, that S3 is object based, and these objects basically you can think of as just files. So these objects, they consist of the following. We have what's called as a key, and this is simply just the name of the object. So the file name of your object is what's referred to as a key. Then we have something called as a value. So this is simply the data that your object is made up of. So it's made up of sequence of bytes. So it's just the data. We then have something called as a version ID, and this is important in case of versioning. So what versioning is, basically we'll have a look at it in the next slide. We then have something called as a metadata. So this is simply the data about your data. And we also have something called as sub resources. So bucket ACLs, torrents, etc. We're going to have a look at it later on. We'll see what all is a bucket policy, what are the access control lists, and things like that. So we were talking about versioning. So what is versioning? So versioning basically allows you to have multiple versions of a file. And to understand, let's take a simple example of, let's say, a PPT that you made for your boss, and you named it Project 1.0. And you go and show it to your boss, and he asks you to do some changes to your PPT. All right. You then go and make all those changes, and now you name it Project 1.1. Right. And finally, after you've done all the changes and stuff, you go to your boss, and he's all happy with it, and he wants you to release it now. Now, when you release the final version after having the final discussion with your boss, you now name it Project 2.0. Right. So you could have basically kept a single file and made all those changes basically to the same file without, making different versions of it every time. But that wouldn't have given you a chance to have an option to look at the previous versions in case, your boss changed his mind or something. Right. So versioning is a means of keeping multiple variants of an object in the same bucket. Okay. So you can use versioning to, let's say, preserve, retrieve, and restore every version of every object that is stored in your Amazon S3 bucket. And with versioning, you can easily recover from both unintended user actions and application failures, right? So when you enable versioning for a bucket, if S3 receives multiple write requests from the same object simultaneously, then it stores all of those objects. So let's say some application is writing some data to your S3, and your S3 receives multiple write requests for the same object simultaneously. It'll store all those objects all in basically different versions. So if you enable versioning for a bucket, Amazon S3 will automatically generate what's called as a unique ID for that object being stored, right? So in a bucket, for example, if you have two objects with the same key, that the same way that you can see on your screen, it has, so you can have two objects with the same key ID, but it has different version IDs, such as you can see that, photo.gif has basically two key IDs. So we have version 11111, and then we have for the same object photo.gif, we have version 121212, right? So basically version, if your versioning is enabled on your buckets, it enables you to recover objects from accidental deletion or override and stuff like that. So for example, let's say if you delete an object, okay, so instead of removing it, so let's say this is one object that is stored in your bucket. All right. So let's say you accidentally go ahead and delete it, or somebody in your team goes ahead and accidentally deletes it, or let's say there is an application failure, or there is an overwrite So basically, if versioning is not enabled, you tend to lose that data, right? But in case versioning is enabled, and let's say somebody or you accidentally delete it, or there is an application overwrite, what happens is Amazon S3 will insert what's called as a delete marker. All right. So this delete marker will then become the current version, object version. All right. And you can always restore the previous version. So basically what happens is, if you accidentally delete this photo.gif object, right? If versioning is enabled, it will not delete it per se. What it'll do is it'll actually create a new version of it. Okay. And it'll call it with the same name and have a delete marker placed in front of it. So if you want to recover it, you can just simply go and recover it back and have the previous version up and running like it was before, right? And if you overwrite an object, it results in again a new object version in the bucket. So you can always restore to the previous version. So this is how versioning works. And one more thing that you might want to remember is when you enable versioning on a bucket, you cannot undo it. That means if versioning is enabled, you can't remove versioning from the bucket. So the only solution that you have is to either suspend the versioning. So that means kind of you pause it for the while, or you'll have to just delete the bucket and create it from scratch and not have the versioning enabled on it. So you might want to basically think about having versioning actually enabled, and then only you go ahead and enable it. Because if you otherwise enable versioning and then later on you change your mind, then it's not going to work actually. So this is very important to understand. The buckets can be in any one of the three states that you can see on your screen. So we have what's called as an unversioned. That means when you provision a bucket, the default setting is it's unversioned. The versioning is not enabled on the bucket, right? The second state in which the bucket can be is if you enable versioning, right? And the third state is in case you plan to suspend it. So there is no versioning disabled or anything of that sort, right? You cannot disable versioning once it has been enabled on a bucket. Well, that's about it in this lecture. I'll see you all in the next one, wherein we'll further explore the S3 bucket. See you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.